help me welcome Professor Tamie Glass, who's our first Hyde lecturer for the spring semester. Professor Tamie Glass is a distinguished educator, interior designer, and author of the Interior Design Educators Council 2020 Book of the Year, Prompt, Socially Engaging Objects and Environments. Professor Glass previously held a tenure track position and directed she held tenure. I have to correct that, and directed the interior design program at the University of Texas School of Architecture before moving on to the University of Texas School of Design and Creative Technologies in the College of Fine Arts. Professor Glass currently serves as the inaugural faculty director for the Masters of Arts in Design, focused on health program and interdisciplinary initiative in collaboration with the Dell Medical School. Professor Glass began her international career in Germany with projects for Mercedes-Benz, moving on to work in London for Virgil and Stone and Conran. Professor Glass has developed a broad portfolio of design work in hospitality, retail, wellness, healthcare, corporate, and residential design across Europe, Asia, and the United States. Professor Glass has also led numerous design thinking workshops and consulted in various campus units, including the Dell Medical School's Design Institute for Health and the Blanton Museum of Art. For this lecture, Professor Glass explores how a relational mindset and intentional design can prompt meaningful interactions among people, places, and products to enhance the well-being, connection, comfort, safety, belonging, and empowerment. I have one little housekeeping thing to keep in mind. There will be a question and answer session at the very end of the lecture. If you or any questions pop up in your mind during the lecture, write it down. We'll have some time dedicated to ask those questions. Just raise your hand at the end of the lecture. I'll run to you. I'll give you our handheld mic, and you can ask the question. All right. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Glass for her Hyde lecture titled Prompting Healthful Partnerships.
Okay, can everybody hear me? All right. Aziza, thank you so much for that really, really kind introduction. It's always weird to hear yourself talked about, especially when you're sitting right there. So thank you. I'm really honored to be here to sort of kick off the spring portion of your Hyde lecture series. And by way of introduction, I thought I would share this series of pictures, which I think it helps to show you that I've always been really fascinated by sort of making spaces for people. So here I am, 8 years old, in a fort that I designed and built at my home that was still is, not past tense, in rural Texas. And you can see that I have a number of things that are added to the interior to sort of help mitigate between the interior space and the human occupant. So I have a seat, very important. I have a shelf, which was there to hang my purse on, which for some reason I thought was really important to have in the middle of the woods. There's a battery-operated lamp. There's a bag of Lay's potato chips to sort of help in case the occupant gets hungry. Since this time in 1983, I've moved on from the fort construction business to designing all kinds of other spaces, as Aziza mentioned in the introduction. And, I was thinking back to when I was a student and sort of what I was sort of aspiring to do. And, I was really fascinated by all of the glossy pictures that you see on the covers of magazines. And that's what I wanted to do. So I set out, I moved to London and, kind of moved forward with my intention to design those types of spaces. And I've been really, really blessed and sort of thankful to have had a career that's let me work on all kinds of different typologies. So I haven't necessarily focused on any particular one. And so you can see I've been able to work on a number of things. So, a luxury boutique, different types of hospitality environments, to museums, hospitals, people's homes. And so I realized kind of like over time that I became less and less interested in the glossy sort of magazine shots that you see here, and much more interested in all of the interactions, the stories, the behaviors that these types of places afforded people. And so in some ways, I've kind of reverted back to that 8-year-old girl who was really interested in making spaces and then adapting those for people, and realizing that the act of making spaces is what actually helps shape people's experiences. And so that sort of brings me full circle to where we are. So when I first started teaching at the University of Texas in Austin, one of the first classes I taught, you'll remember this class, Kendra, Designing for Human Behavior. And so, I could tell from this class that students were really, really interested in designing for people and what people wanted and what people desired. But then they would move into the interior design studio environment, and then there's so many other things competing for their attention. And some of you are probably experiencing that right now in your studios. As I've seen some of your work today, you're kind of getting to the place where you're starting to give presentations of your work. And sometimes it just seems like the person can get lost in all of that. So I wanted to, kind of realize that there's this gap. So there's no lack of desire for wanting to design for people, but there is a lack of knowing how to design for people, and a way for keeping that sort of front and center. And that we all, in some ways, both students and professionals, really lack some of the strategies that would be helpful for us to be able to make that a more prominent part of our work. And so for me, I think what's really critical about that is something called psychosocial design. Try to say that 3 times fast, and it's a mouthful. But what I mean by psychosocial design is really looking at both the psychological aspect and the social context for which we're designing, and putting that together and really thinking about how those can contribute to the ways in which you design spaces to sort of best fit people. So in order to really start to address this gap that I was experiencing between the human behavior class and designing in interior design studios, I wrote a book to help with that. And so with this direct intention to try and find a way to kind of bridge that, and to help us start to build up a psychosocial design toolkit that we could use to design for people. So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to focus on, we're going to pull out a few case studies from this book, along with a project that I've been working on. And I'll sort of walk you through the ways in which you can use the frameworks in the book to start to design healthful partnerships, which gets us to the title for our talk today. So let's dive right into it. All right, so I want to give you a guiding question, which is, I'll give you a moment to read the question. So, how might we form partnerships with objects and environments to build healthful relationships with our surroundings? And I think one of the ways that we can do that is through psychosocial design, which made me start to think back So how is it that we start design projects? You know, if we're realizing there's a gap in design studios, how is it that we start designing? And if we're going to take a more psychosocial approach, it has to be in the early stages of a project. You don't sort of come in toward the end and say, oh, okay, now we're going to design for people. We're going to design for psychology and social context at the end. We're going to do that starting in the beginning. And so I was kind of thinking back to my own design studio teaching and thinking about how it is that we teach programming. So kind of pre-design and programming parts of a project. And I don't know about some of my colleagues here, but one of the readings I would always have students do is about the 24 programmatic concepts. And these are, you know, basically abstract ideas that you can use to begin to define the problem that you're designing for and to set out some of your design intentions. And often it's sort of in collaboration with a client. But in design studio, you know, whether or not you have a client, you can still kind of start to set these early project intentions. And these can be things like expandability, hierarchy, types of flow, different types of activity groupings. Is this sort of ringing a bell? I see some heads nodding. Okay. So those concepts come out of William Pena's problem-seeking method, which you can see the cover of from sort of came about in the late 60s, early 70s. And all of those 24 programmatic concepts funnel through these sort of four lenses that you see here. So function, form, economy, and time. So as I was looking through the original publication, I stumbled onto this statement, and I'll let you read this. Okay, I don't know how fast you read. Hopefully that gave you a second. To me, this alludes to having a behavioral scientist on your projects, which, boy, if we could do that, how amazing would that be? Unfortunately, most projects don't have the funding or the scope to really be able to have that sort of luxury of having a behavioral scientist on board. But it also made me start to think about what is it that we're actually expected to know as designers? And has that changed from 1969? I suspect it has changed. And so it made me think about this diagram, which is from Rethinking Design and Interiors by Sashi Khan. I saw that she was here like in 2017, 18 for one of the Hyde lectures. And if you look at this, maybe a little bit hard for some of you in the back to see, but we start out with the kind of the origins of the interior design profession, but you could substitute architecture, product design, other areas into this. So this isn't exclusive to interior design in any way. And those early, kind of what we were expected to know early on was around design foundations, art, theory, history. And then all of a sudden, over time, the scope grew. And it got wider and wider and wider to what you see here now and what they're calling 21st century design knowledge. And you're expected to not only know, it doesn't mean that you don't have to know what's in the center. You just have to know the full breadth of all of this, including cognition and behavior and social sciences, which are on the outer edges of this diagram. So things definitely have changed from the sort of 1969 version of problem seeking, and that having a behavioral scientist on board is kind of an expectation to, well, gosh, now we as designers are expected to have a pretty firm understanding of how to do that, except for we're still using the 24 programmatic concepts. We haven't necessarily changed the way we do pre-design or programming to really start to incorporate this a little bit more. So this leads me to kind of something I'm working on right now, which is a project that is an edited book together with a social psychologist. And she and I are editing a collection of essays that are really looking at where people and spaces and objects start to come together. And that's where things happen. Like, that's where, in that overlap, that's where experiences happen. That's where the kind of messy human business takes place. But in order to design skillfully for this experience that you see in the center, you have to know how to engage people for that, and how to get people to engage both with the spaces and objects and with each other to be able to derive the type of experience that you're aiming for. And that takes a certain intentionality. And that's something that I think we haven't really spent a lot of time exploring in terms of design strategies and kind of starting to incorporate that into our pre-design and programming process. So what I did as part of the book was to develop a taxonomy for social engagement that I think can help us start to build out our psychosocial toolkit in a way. And to do this, I analyzed 36 case studies, actually more than that. There were 36 that ended up in the publication. And each of these contributed to creating this framework, which each of these circles represents a different type of engagement. So if we look at the top two circles, these circles in white that say harmonious integration and challenging provocation, you can think about those as two ends of a spectrum. You're either designing a space to be very harmonious, or maybe you're designing a space to be intentionally sort of provocative. You know, a lot of museums and things that we go to, you know, there might be an exhibition that's intended to sort of, you know, provoke something to get you to think beyond maybe, you know, typical constructs. And then we have the other four that you see in the large black circles. And these are things like stimulation, communication, transactions, and transformation. And I see these as more granular forms of engagement. And you can think of these four circles almost like dials that you can start to kind of dial up or dial down and tune the type of engagement that you want to have within a project. Okay. So I know this diagram is a lot to take in. We will come back and we'll sort of revisit each of those, or revisit this with each of the case studies that we're going to talk about today, so that you can start to see how this plays out. So we'll unpack it, and we're going to look at, I'm going to share 5 case studies. I'm going to share them at a pretty high level, so don't panic. We will get you out of here in an hour. And then with each of those, they're going to graduate and scale from looking at an object, to looking at an atmosphere, to a surface, to entire environments, and then towards systems. And for each of those, I'll help you see the type of engagement category that it's coming from. And if there's, some of these have specific strategies as well, so I'll fill you in on those so that you can get a sense of how it works. Okay, so let's start with the first case study, which is going to focus on an object. And to start each of these case studies, I'm going to share with you what I consider to be a universal truth. So the first one is that goals can be advanced by forming alliances with objects around us. And if you want to, you can think about goals broadly, or in the case of our lecture, you can think about this as health goals. So anybody have the health goal to be fit? Okay, after I was out of breath walking up the flights of stairs here, it's one of those things that I think about a lot. So, when we think about healthful living, physical fitness is one of those that sort of comes up for a lot of people. And when you're thinking about physical fitness and the types of partnerships that might help you get more physically fit, think about the things that come to mind. So for me, some of those partnerships are, maybe a trainer, if you're lucky enough to have a trainer. It might be a favorite Peloton instructor. Maybe it's just an accountability buddy that's like, hey, it's time, got to go. And so those are all person-to-person partnerships. But what about person-to-object partnerships? And so I'm not trying to say that, I'm not trying to diminish the person-to-person. That's very important. But how can we also incorporate more of our physical world into that equation? So this particular case study is called Clunes, and it was designed by two students from the Copenhagen Institute of Interaction. And their client was IKEA's Space 10, which IKEA used to have a sort of experimental lab. I was sad to see that it's shut down, unfortunately. But this is how this particular project works. So you set your goal, you set your fitness goal, which might be steps, it might be something else. A lot of us track that through maybe smartwatch or a Fitbit or your phone. So you set that as you normally would, and then you pair it with a familiar object, in this case, a chair. And the seat of the chair is elevated when you haven't met your goal. And then once you have eventually, hopefully, met your goal for that day, then the seat goes back down to its normal place, and it can start all over the next day. And so it serves as this visual reminder that you haven't quite gotten to where you want to be in your fitness goal. So you set your goal. I think this is a fun thing to show for students because it shows this idea of kind of a sequence of interactions. And you could imagine doing this for your projects. You set your goal, you pair your technology with your object, you leave for the day, start working on your goal, and then you can come back and hopefully take a load off when you've met your goal. So, and I also am going to show this picture because I think as students, sometimes we think, designing with technology, that's kind of tough. How do we represent those kinds of things? And so this is a pretty rudimentary prototype that they built. And you can see some of their kind of, rough and ready retrofitting that they've done of an existing chair to be able to get the seat to go up and down with a kind of basic motor and sensing technology. So that brings us back to our chair. And what I really kind of love about this case study is that it's like the opposite of the lazy boy recliner. It is quite literally the opposite of that. And so it also makes me think, in a world where almost all of the solutions involve designing an app, sometimes we tell students, you can't design an app for this. Like we will veto, like that's not an option. Just because it seems to be the default for so many things. So while this does include an app, it does something that goes a bit further. So it's taking that app and then pairing it with something in the physical realm to kind of expand the capabilities. And so what I'd love for you to be able to kind of think about with this is that how could you incorporate, maybe it's a chair, maybe it's a light fixture, what are some of the things that you could start to incorporate in sort of ways, responsive ways, that they can become environmental cues sort of beyond the digital screens that we spend so much time on. So this is an example of interactive transaction because it has this responsive quality. And in particular, interactive transactions are derived from transactional theory. And transactional theory basically claims that humans and their environments are mutually supportive, that they sort of rely on each other. It is opposite of separatism. Separatism basically says that humans and their environments are two separate things, and that one is always sort of in dominance over the other. So yes, we do often dominate over our spaces. That's not necessarily untrue. But these ideas of like responsive or reciprocal relationships are becoming more and more prevalent, in part because technology has become so much more affordable and accessible. So I think it allows us to do a little bit more than what we've been able to do in the past. And in particular, I call this an unconventional alliance. And this is where you can link together people and an object so that they can become this active companion. They can become part of an alliance where neither one of you is passive. You actually have to work together. So there's usually some kind of dynamic action. That might be a sound, it might be emotion or some kind of touch, and then it will trigger some kind of action. So, maybe it triggers the seat going up or down. And then at other times, it triggers a whole complex series of interactions. And I'm going to show you an example that starts to do that, that's a bit more complex. So what I really want you to come away with this particular case study is that we can be very intentional about our setting up interactive transactions and forming these kinds of unconventional alliances. And when we do that, it lets us sort of re-envision or reimagine things that are very familiar to us and start to think about what else could they do other than what we typically think they're going to do or be able to do. So objects do not have to be static. They can be they can be active partners with us to help us in our health journeys and help us accomplish the goals that we set out. Okay, so that covers objects. Check that off the list. And we're going to transition now to talking about atmospheres. And when I say atmosphere, do folks know what I'm referring to? Yes, no? Okay, I see some heads shaking. So by atmosphere, I mean pretty much ambient conditions. So it might be temperature, it might be sound, it might be lighting, those things that you can't quite, pinpoint. So that's what I mean by atmosphere. And so the next universal truth is that atmospheres can be activated, and then in return, they can actually activate us. Anyone feel like this? Maybe today? Maybe in studio? Just like, oh, gosh. So another situation that is a big concern for a lot of us is stress. And a little bit of stress is good for us. A little bit of stress means I can stand up here and give this presentation to you all. Too much stress, we all know, can be detrimental to our physical and mental well-being. And so, which then leads to all kinds of other things, both to the health system, to our employers, to academic systems. And so stress is something that I think we're, especially post-COVID, that we're constantly trying to figure out how are we gonna address this. And so this next case study is actually was designed to address this specific issue, and in particular to do it within workplace environments. And so it's called RESET, and it stands for Responsive Emotional Transformation. And it was designed by UN Studio along with some of those behavioral scientists that we all said we needed. And basically what they're doing is they have determined a set of scientifically proven ways to combat stress and to bring about a reduction of the stress that we experience. And so there's a series of microenvironments that you can select from, and then you can enter those and have a different experience. So there's 6 in total, 6 different experiences that you can go into for reducing your stress. And they come in all different varieties. So sometimes some people appreciate meditation. I, for one, struggle a bit with meditation. It just makes my mind like race more. And so other people want to like blow off some steam, and that's more helpful for you to reduce stress. And there's even a pod that is catered to laugh therapy, which I think is fantastic. We should all have a laugh therapy pod in our lives. And so each interior, and you can kind of see these drawings over here to the right, is the interior is really sort of customized to the type of activity or experience you're intended to have in that space and kind of the radius of your body and the movements that you would have. All right, so one really important part of Reset is that it incorporates biofeedback. So each of the pods is building off of a pretty large data set, but then that data set of how people generally address stress and what's good for them gets combined with your individual biofeedback. So what's your heart rate, what's your temperature, those kinds of things. And then they work in combination to help you achieve that more reduced state, stress-reduced state, so that you can start to sort of calm your body. The atmospheric conditions, which is what we were talking about in this case, the atmosphere responds to your motions, to what you're doing within that space. So the lighting, the sound, those actually kind of interact with what you're doing. So what does that look like? Okay, so in one pod, you can go in and sort of blow off steam by putting on a headset and like banging on this electric drum set. And then when you're doing that, you can start to discover different sounds around the room, and the lighting actually kind of helps nudge you along. It encourages you to have more and more activity, which is what helps you achieve stress reduction in that particular scenario. But then there's this scenario. And I feel like many people in here could really get into that right now. So this particular scenario, the idea is that you take your shoes off, you walk into this pod, you can lie down or sit in this sort of sectional, the idea is that the designers say they want it to feel like a warm embrace, that it kind of embraces your body. And what it does is the lighting and the sound conditions are responding to your heart rate. So if you go in and you're stressed and your heart rate is elevated, then the atmospheric condition is going to be a little bit more active. But it's going to start to slow down as a way of helping you slow your heart rate. And the more you slow, the more it slows. So it enters into this sort of like feedback loop until you reach this desired state that's a bit more meditative. So Reset is another one of these interactive transactions, but it has a different strategy. And I consider this strategy to be an immersive partnership, which one of the really, what's remarkable or distinctive about this strategy is that you end up in this sort of continuous loop. And you're trying to reach a sort of equilibrium state. No one part of that partnership is dominating over the other, but it's not just a single action like the seat goes up or down. In this case, it keeps going. Okay. So the takeaway from this particular case study is that when you're designing an immersive partnership, there's an opportunity to really take on board behavioral research and sort of define what an always-on atmospheric layer could do within a design. And using these sorts of transactions and partnerships, you can create atmospheres that build and drive healthful behaviors. So you can set up that exchange to reach a healthful state. Okay, so we've got objects, we've got atmospheres. How are we doing? Okay, let's talk a little bit about surfaces. So what happens if surfaces can pay attention to us? And I don't mean in like a creepy way, pay attention to us. There are certainly in all of these case studies, there are ethical questions and things to be addressed and talked about. But conceptually, what happens when surfaces can really be sort of attentive and communicate with and for us? So I want to talk about a situation that I think we're all likely to encounter at some point in time, either personally or maybe through a friend or a family member. So according to the CDC, every second of every day, an older adult suffers a fall in the US. Isn't that staggering? That's a crazy statistic. So that makes falls the leading cause of injury and injury-related deaths in that age group in the US. So this particular case study helps with that. And what this is it's called SenseFloor, and it is a smart textile. It's an underlayment that goes under any floor finish, which just like baffles me how it could go under virtually any floor finish and function. And it helps you determine if someone is lying on the floor, and when that happens, it can call for help. So that's sort of programmed into the smart textile. One of the first installations of SenseFloor was in a assisted living facility in France. There were 70 patient rooms. In the first 4 months, it alerted staff to 28 falls in those patient rooms. And so they were able to monitor remotely what was happening in the rooms and then get there as quickly as possible to help the patient who had fallen. It can do some other things, which I think are pretty cool. It can actually track and document changes in your gait. So the way that we walk can be a really strong indicator of our health. And so it can indicate certain health conditions. For example, Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis starts to change your gait. And sometimes it can actually pick up that someone is on the verge of entering, into, broaching Parkinson's or something like that before they even know that it's happening. So you can begin to imagine having something like this within a nursing home or a hospital that could also be providing more information, which is pretty amazing. And then it can do things like when you get out of bed, it can turn the lights on so that you can see to get to the bathroom. It can determine if there's a spill or a leak. It can set off an alarm if there's an intruder. So you can imagine all of these things being ways that someone could age in place, could keep them in their homes a little bit longer. So very, very important technology, which if you look it up, you can see all kinds of applications. You can also do really cool installations with it, and you can program the textile to do virtually anything. But I think this application is pretty amazing. So this is an example of intuitive communication. And the way I think about intuitive communication is it's like body language for environments. So this particular category of engagement involves exchanges of information that then drives an action. So SenseFloor is using something that I call technology coupling. And if you think about it, it's a technology layer that you can then, like any other material, include it in a material assembly. So it could become part of a flooring assembly, maybe a wall or ceiling assembly. And when you do that, that surface can be, the entire surface can become a digital interface. So in this case study, the third case study that we're looking at, it's employing these different strategies, like technology coupling, and it's doing something that I think is really important. It means that surfaces can sense our needs to ensure safety and comfort, and even help diagnose conditions that might be impacting our health. That's pretty impressive. Okay, so we're gonna go from the micro to the macro, and we're gonna look at sort of an entire environment. And I wanna get you to think about what happens when an entire environment is tailored toward a particular thing that you need and want. Anybody like Disneyland? Okay, some hands going up. Okay, so Disneyland. Disneyland is definitely designed and tailored to a set of needs and wants. More wants than needs, but I would say we need to have fun, right? So Disneyland is designed for entertainment, for fun, for joy. It is really tailored to that. So what if we could actually create environments that are tailored for specific health conditions, that are tailored to the same extent that maybe Disneyland is for fun and entertainment? If we look at the same population that we were looking at for the last case study, there are an estimated 6.7 million Americans ages 65 and older that are living with Alzheimer's dementia today in the US. So almost everyone in this room probably knows someone or has known someone that was suffering and living with dementia. Not necessarily Alzheimer's, but maybe other forms of dementia. So this case study is known as a Dementia Village, and it's located outside of Amsterdam. And if anybody has maybe you used Dak Kopech's textbook, or you've seen some writings by him. So this is something that Dak would call an example of person and condition-centered design. There's 152 residents that live in these houses. The houses accommodate 6 to 7 people per house. And what we're looking at here are the exterior facades. And the exterior is meant to really kind of safeguard people, because once people living with dementia experience a lot of stress in a lot of different situations. And it can start to provoke and sort of agitate the situation, make it worse. They start to lose their sense of time and place. And so this is designed like a traditional Dutch village. And so the houses are all along the perimeter. They face inward with a series of gardens and sort of a town square. And this is one of my favorite aspects of this particular project. All of the residents live in houses, and the houses all have different, what they're calling lifestyles. So there are different floor plans, different finish palettes, different colors and furnishings. And so the resident and their families get to decide which one of those fits the resident the best, that they will feel the most comfortable in. And details such as art, dishware, decorations, all of those things are intentionally selected to lend a sense of familiarity so that they can see things that they might have seen in their own homes or in homes of friends that look familiar to them. There's a number of different amenities, just like you might have in any neighborhood. There's a salon, there's a theater, there's a pub. And what we're looking at here is a supermarket, which I think the supermarket is a really good example of what it is that the creators were trying to do with this particular place is that it has rows, aisles of familiar products. They have fresh produce, but there are no price tags on anything. And even though there's a cashier, there's no money exchange. And all of the people working in the supermarket are actually trained employees that know how to interact with people who are living with dementia. And so, residents are able to go and have a familiar experience. And then staff actually, they help support the residents. They are assigned to individual homes, residences, and they sort of work with the residents that live in each of these as they might, care for a loved one and who's in their own house. And so they also wear plain clothes so that has this sort of non-institutional feeling. And staff and residents will go and do sort of normal daily activities. They might go to the supermarket, they might prepare meals, they do laundry, do all the sort of things that you and I, all of us, would normally do to have some sense of normalcy for these residents. Okay, so this is harmonious integration. That's one of these holistic conditions, right, that's at either end of the spectrum. And in particular, what I want to share about harmonious integration is, first of all, this is mostly what we as designers try to do. Like, we're usually trying to make spaces for people that actually fit what it is that they're doing. This project and Disneyland and others can go really extreme. And what makes this sort of a pinnacle of harmonious integration is that it's looking at these really unique situations, and then it's tailoring for those situations. And they're looking at things like the grocery store, the living experience, the residential living experience. And to get a harmonious integration, you want to have the layout, which might be, that means the village, the way it's sort of oriented toward the courtyard and the town square, and all of the different residential layouts. You want that to match up or sync up with the behavior pattern that's happening there. And in this case, the behavior pattern is intended to be sort of non-institutional living in a safe environment. And so when the layout and the behavior patterns sync up, then you have something that is considered to be extremely harmonious. To do this type of work requires really empathetic programming. You have to really understand people that are living with a particular health condition and what that means. And so as you're thinking about directions and places that you could go with having sort of a health or healthcare design career, this is something to think about. How might you be able to design facilities that were condition specific? So in this next to last case study that we were looking at here, we're looking at it through the lens of harmonious integration and how designers can tailor environments to what we need and want. So environments can thoughtfully accommodate condition-specific health needs. All right, so we're going to move on to our final case study, which is looking more at a whole system. And we're going to think about, I'd love for you to think about maybe the last time you went to see the doctor. Okay, I see some heads nodding. How was that experience? Good? Bad? Good? I'm seeing some downs and some halfways. Okay, so for those of you that rated it pretty high, you're probably receiving care from a more holistic group that really understands the importance of systems design. So the whole system is sort of geared toward a more positive experience. Those of you that kind of gave it a thumbs down, You might be wondering, okay, does healthcare really have to be this way? Is this really the best that we can do? Couldn't it possibly be different? And so I was working with a client recently, and we started talking about, again, as a provocation, could healthcare, or going to the doctor, I should say, could it look more like this? Could it feel more like this? And this is certainly not to take away from sort of traditional clinical care. There are times and places when we need very traditional clinical care. But for regular checkups, could it look a little different? And so what we set out to do was to design an ecosystem of care for this startup healthcare company in Austin, Texas. And for them, having or kind of defaulting to conventional architecture was a last resort. They did not want to do that. And so we started looking at all different other types of ways that we could begin to provide environments. So we looked at things that were automated. We looked at microarchitecture, semi-permanent solutions, and we ended up landing on mostly vehicular options. So healthcare is often associated with a lot of things, including sickness, frustration, and inconvenience. We knew that vehicular options could help, especially with that convenience factor. So what if care could come to us and we didn't have to go to it? How might that help us? But one of the challenges that the client faces with this particular solution is that there's a stigma that comes along with these sort of temporary environments, that maybe they're low quality or they're cheap, or if we think about when is it that we often see mobile solutions for health or healthcare. A lot of times it's sort of emergency care, disaster situations, but not so much for just everyday care needs. And so that's where really thinking about this as a challenging provocation starts to come into play. So the startup's new model is really based on a fleet of transit vans and semi-trucks, and they provide primary care along with some lighter clinical needs. And then to deal with more specialty care, the strategy was to take existing clinics and sort of take over those clinics and rework them for the new service model, but not to build anything new. So the challenging provocation is really asking patients to re-envision where and how they receive their care. And in particular, we're looking at this as a typology transfer. And so this is taking one typology and letting it influence something else. So this is not all that uncommon, especially in healthcare. So if we think about healthcare, it has been significantly influenced by hospitality design. So taking hospitality design as one typology and transferring it over to healthcare. In this case, we're swapping out sort of the conventional approach to a clinic with a mobile solution and arriving at an overall feeling that's more like a trailer park than a medical office building. So what stands out to me with this last case study is that we can intentionally test these social constructs. You can sort of poke and prod at them a bit. Not necessarily in, say, an emergency room. That is not a time and place to do a challenging provocation. But in other cases related to health and healthcare, it could be. So overall, systems can challenge deeply ingrained beliefs, offering new ways to pursue healthfulness. All right, so in summary, we have looked at objects, we've looked at surfaces, environments, and entire systems. Objects do not have to be static. They can be active partners in our health journeys. Atmospheres can build exchanges that drive healthful behaviors. Surfaces can sense our needs to ensure safety and comfort, and maybe even diagnose conditions impacting a healthful life. Environments can thoughtfully accommodate condition-specific health needs. And finally, systems can challenge deeply ingrained beliefs, offering new ways to pursue healthfulness. So if we come back, complete the circle, go back to our guiding question, looking at how might we form partnerships with objects and environments to build these healthful relationships. And for me, this has a lot to do with psychosocial design. This is one way in which we can do that. And for me, incorporating new frameworks that start to bring psychosocial design to the surface of our kind of pre-design and programming phases of projects is somewhat of a missing link. And the more that we can do that, the more likely we are to create intentionally engaging environments that can help us through these sort of, our health and wellness journeys throughout our lives. So with that, I think we can stop and take questions. Thank you.
Much. Thank you very much, Professor Tamie Glass, for that wonderful lecture. All right, who has a question? Okay, go ahead.
Hello, I just wanted to thank you for coming, first of all. I really, really appreciated this lecture. The question that kind of came to mind for me as a student was, where do you think the breakdown in this psychosocial design being implemented starts to come from? Do you think it's a matter of professors not teaching it, students not seeking it out? Do you think it's maybe a budget concern as it becomes more of a real world application? I was just wondering where you think we can start to address it as the new generation.
I think it's just that there's just so much vying for your attention. And in terms of, faculty members, there's a lot to teach a student who's learning to master interior design, product design, architecture for the first time. Any of these, landscape architecture, any of these areas, there's so much you have to know. And this is one sliver of that. But it's a really important sliver. And so, I think the interior design curriculum in particular really calls out having classes that focus on human factors, which is, kind of the early origins of this. And so I think, making it a part of the way programs are accredited is one place to do this, because it starts to, accreditations start to surface the priorities of how faculty teach. And so there's a lot of boxes to tick, though, within that. And so I think that's a good place to start.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Got a question over here. I feel like I'm competing with the really beautiful weather outside. It's just not fair.
You showed a lot of new technology that I hadn't been aware of. A lot of this technology, I feel, that could be incorporated into our residential designs in order to help with the psychosocial design. How do we explore that technology in order to include it in our designs?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And in the book, in Prompt, I've really tried to balance both sort of technology-based and more low-tech examples. The ones that are pulled for this, a lot of them are, reliant on technology. we're moving into a place where the technology, I think we used to have to know how to do the technology, and we do still have to obviously know how it works, how to incorporate it. That's a whole area of expertise that, designers can't possibly, it's a whole nother thing, another box they'd have to tick. What I think is important to understand is what the capabilities of the technology are. And I think part of what limits us the most is just imagining what you could do with it. And so like the Sense floor, the underlay that I was showing, that started to really blow my mind when I was looking into some of the projects, because that underlay can be programmed to do virtually anything. And so one of the installations of it is that when you walk across the floor, there are all of these sort of glass shards. And as you walk across, they move out of your way. It's this kind of really amazing interactive exhibition. But it's a floor underlay. Like, part of it is just limited by your imagination of what you could do with it. So I think, it starts to, the question starts to come about, how do we teach students, and how do we bring that into the classroom in a way that students can begin to understand what the potential is. And yeah, I think that's it's a challenge for sure. I don't know if that answers your question. More or less. My students are like, you never answer the question. You always skirt around. Great.
So that's
Yeah.
why I was asking the question,
Yeah.
not as a teacher, but as a student.
Yeah. So I just think it is hard to imagine. It's a different way of thinking. And I think for all of us, we're trying to figure it out. It's just like trying to incorporate AI into our classes and figure out a whole new way of practicing that includes this, new technology. I mean, we say new. A lot of the technology that I'm showing has been around for decades. It just is only now becoming accessible and affordable. But, the MIT Media Lab, the stuff goes back to like the 90s, and a lot of these, it just wasn't, it's not prevalent to the rest of the world for a while until it becomes more affordable. So, thank you. Thanks for joining. Other questions?
Definitely gonna close my health rings today. All right.
So do you think it's possible to achieve a psychosocial design utilizing, or I guess not using an advanced technology, or utilizing something really simple, say like just a simple material and using it in a new way that we're not already using?
For sure, absolutely. I do not think it has to be a technology-based solution. I think that anything that starts to really understand human behavior and the social context that it's within, we do this all the time. All sorts of projects do this already. I think that technology, in some ways, just opens up the door to some new possibilities and takes some of the things that we do and can kind of, escalate it or elevate it to another level. But we already do this, and designers have been doing it for, centuries, whatever, millennia, however long we've had designers, and we'll keep doing it. But it might be that technology it starts to play a larger and larger role, I think. Yeah, great question.
I had a question about like how narrow these certain solutions should be moving forward, since I know there's a lot of attention to things like mixed-use buildings now. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts on, should we broaden the scope of some of these solutions, some of these like the examples that were shown, should we broaden the audience of those, or should we narrow down more?
I mean, I think it depends on if you're a product designer or an industrial designer and you're really working at the scale of an object, then that's your media. That's where your opportunity lies. And if you are, I think the Dementia Village and the last project, the Harbor Health project with the ecosystem, I wanted to be able to kind of show that full span from something that's one object to an entire network of spaces, because I don't think it's limited or dictated by a single scale. And it should be something that can be really large scale or really small scale. It's really just the intention behind it. Come on, Aziza.
So a lot of the case studies that you presented, you kind of look through the lens of one of the psychosocial, and taxonomy of engagement that we see here on the screen. Do you see them often working together and finding some sort of collaboration between those black circles?
For sure, for sure. So when I think about the two white circles, I think, for anybody that's studied the big five personality traits, like introversion, extroversion, you fall somewhere along the introversion scale. You're more or less. It's not binary. It's not one or the other. And so I see those two conditions as being similar to that. But all of the others, I think you can begin to, you could start to pair them up and use them in different ways. So for example, one of them is, we didn't talk about it today, but it's about sensory stimulation. So it's not to say that if you choose, if you don't go with that particular strategy, that you're not engaging the senses. It just might not be a sort of top priority. And so the idea about this is really to just kind of help you set some of these priorities. At a high level, what are the types of engagement that you want to have? And if sensory stimulation is one of those, then you can put that as a kind of top tier thing that you want to focus on. But it's not to say that you wouldn't focus on that as a designer. You would still look at what's the, how do people engage with this? What are the sensory experiences of that? All of you, whether or not you've seen this taxonomy or not, think about how you design for the senses. But when does it become, one of your top objectives? And that's when, this is just sort of help you figure out what are those, high level, what would you put at the very top tier of what you want to design for?
Thank you.
Thank you. Really quickly, I want to clarify a point that you made. I wrote, the act of making spaces helps form relationships. Did I need to add anything to that or subtract? Is that correct?
So say it again, the act of making spaces.
Helps form relationships.
Yes, so the act of making spaces, I want you to think about, sometimes we have these interpersonal relationships, and that's important. And sometimes the spaces that we're in help support those interpersonal relationships. But where I think things can get interesting and where prompt starts to kind of venture into slightly different territory is that I'm wanting you to also think about the physical environment, that you could be in a relationship, have relational qualities with the physical environment. That it can support you, that it could challenge you, that it could do some of the things that a person might be able to do, that it plays a significant role in your life. And so I want you to kind of think about both person to person and person to object or person to space relationships.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
First of all, thank you for sharing all this. It's fascinating. I'm curious about.
Nick's going to stump me. He's going to give me the hard question.
Well, no, I'm curious about like designer intentions behind some of this stuff. Like as you go through these case studies, do you have a chance to speak with the designers and like as you talk to them, are some of the things they're telling you falling into these buckets for you, or like you know how sort of connectivity with object and
Right.
sort of transactional relationship were the chair designers like keenly aware of, or are they just trying to make something, you know, make an object that works with a phone and
Yeah, so that is a great question. Some of these I was able to have more extensive conversations with the designers, sometimes not as much. And so there is a certain level of extrapolation in a way to come back and think about retroactively, what is it that they did, even if that wasn't necessarily one of their main intentions. And so I've let the case studies serve that purpose. And sometimes it does, you know, the designers really were kind of in that space. And sometimes they were approaching it differently. But in order to come up with a framework, they weren't necessarily thinking, you know, oh, I'm gonna do sort of intuitive communicate, like it didn't exist, right? So I'm sort of going back and taking more of an analytical point of view of what it is that they did to form a framework that then we could use with more intention. And so, you know, I'm sort of taking some leaps. And I think that, you know, one of the things that the book is able to do is a lot of psychosocial, and you could think of it in environmental psychology, behavioral science, a lot of these are textbooks. And they don't really take those kinds of leaps. But I also feel like sometimes they lack some imagination. And so I intentionally said, that's going to be okay. Like, I'm going to take some of those leaps because I think as designers to kind of start to carve out some new ways of thinking about things, we have to do that. It can't always be something that's been done before. And so, yeah, I'm sure I have some you know, hardcore behavioral scientists that might look at this and go, oh, no, I disagree with that. Or maybe that wasn't my, you know, as a designer, that wasn't quite my intention. So it varies. Great question.
I think we might have time for a few more questions.
Frank has a question. Uh-oh.
Thank you. To be honest, I really didn't have a question. I just wanted to see Aziza run. But thank you for coming. And if I don't see you again, just wanted to say good to see you. And
Thank you, Frank.
safe travels back.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
It's like someone from the other side of the room have a question. There we go.
Make her run. I bet that seat is like going down. She's met her step goal. Yeah.
All right, so I think all the case studies are cool, but let's talk about the price. You said they were becoming more affordable. How much is the second case study? Like, how much would it be to incorporate into a building?
So that's a really great question. And I do think that, sorry, I've had a cold. I'm sort of getting over it. I think some of these things, thinking about them at scale, can be really helpful. So something like the textile underlay, yes, it adds to a per square foot cost, but if you're doing it across an entire facility, then that certainly can help with the overall cost. And I think you have to think about the other things, start to put a value or a dollar amount on, for example, how much does it cost that nursing home every time a patient falls and they're not able to get to them quickly enough? What is the cost of that? And so, you know, some of these, especially if you can start to associate them with a value that has to do with health, that can validate in some ways spending the extra on it. But of course, you have to have the money to spend, right? And so it will also take some time for these things to become more and more affordable. If we think about, if we think about OpenAI, we couldn't do the things we're doing now, even a year or 2 years ago. So, there's going to at some point be a tipping point where it is, yes, there's a cost, but it's somewhat nominal in relation to some of the greater cost. Like, for example, with the stress reduction. If you think about, missed days of work because people have become so stressed that they're prone to illness and burnout. If people are quitting because they're just, they've reached a burned out state and they can't keep going, you have to look at what employee turnover costs a company. And so it's part of a much bigger equation. And I think, but you're absolutely right. These things cost money, and you have to factor that in. But the more you think about the big picture, the more likely you are to be able to get funding to do something like that in a larger scale application.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us about the healthful technologies and interactions. I had a question more about the challenging provocation and the last case study that you had, since that was the most kind of challenging of an entire system. So since that is challenging of an entire system, how do you think the best way of actually implementing something like that challenge would be, since it's kind of going against cultural norms? So do you think that maybe, I guess, I just wanted to know your thoughts, how would we even start to change maybe the cultural thought or the psychosocial thought to that system?
I made it all the way through the talk, and now it's hitting me. Great question. You have to have alignment with everyone on board within a company to really kind of do these sorts of challenging projects. And the one that I was just showing you, they were part of the team, a part of the company that was really into being provocative, using design to sort of challenge some of these ways of thinking. And then other parts of the company who were looking at the bottom line and saying, nope, we need to do this just like everybody else has been doing it. Legacy behaviors, legacy systems, that's not all bad. We've got to scale fast. We don't have time for this design stuff. And so it ended up being sort of middle of the road. So some of the things you can see actually happened or are happening. So you can see these are, the trucks exist, the vans exist. But there are lots of other ideas that didn't get implemented because you have to think about it system-wide. You can't just change one thing. You have to think about the entire service model. And having a service designer and having an entire design team, it's a company-wide effort that has to happen to be able to do something like that. So it's really important when you're trying to sort of test a convention, make sure it's a place that people are actually, there's some receptivity to it, and that if you're doing it for a business, is it viable? Is it viable and feasible? Like I said, you wouldn't want an emergency room to be a challenging provocation. That's not somewhere to try and, get people to stop and think about a social construct. There are other times and places where it's absolutely a good time and place to do that. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but thank you.
And on that note, we will conclude today's Hyde lecture. May I ask everyone to stand up? Check it out. All right, so join me in thanking Professor Tamie Glass for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.